Hello, this is Rabbi Juan Marcos Barjona Gutierrez, and coming to you from the sunny city of Minneapolis, where I think it's something like 10 degrees outside. I think tomorrow is going to be -2. So that's an interesting change for me coming from Texas for a few days. I wanted to continue our discussion on crypto-Jews based off my book, Secret Jews, The Complex Identity of Crypto-Jews and Crypto-Judaism. And I wanted to talk about an individual by the name of Alonso de Espina. Alonso de Espina was a friar, and the time frame for his activity is in the 1450s through the early 1460s. He authored a work called The Fortress of Faith, and the book was focused on combating heresies. And one of the primary heresies that Despina was concerned with was Judaizing. He reported that in Segovia, for example, there were Conversos who had celebrated Sukkot by attending a local synagogue. In another town, Fromista, he reported that there was a Converso barber who had declared that he did not believe in Jesus, he only believed in God, and he had done so apparently quite openly. And in other cases, Despina records that he knew of various Conversos who had circumcised themselves, others who were trying to flee. Interestingly, flee to North Africa. Interestingly, he mentions that there were some Conversos that were arguing that the New Testament used the Tanakh, the Hebrew Bible, incorrectly, that some of the references to prophecies and so forth were not used as they were appropriately found in the Hebrew text. And so he continues to list a number of issues that he's concerned with, and from Despina's perspective, Conversos are flagrant Judaizers. They're not even trying to hide it. And so he considers this to be a cancer. It's a disease of the soul, if you will, of the spirit, that's a threat to the church. And so he believes that there must be a strong response to that. Now, what he believed was a solution was basically a reinvigorated Inquisition. Until that time, there had been inquisitions that were under the authority of bishops, local bishops. They had the authority to punish heresy. But the extent of the activities that had been undertaken by that time were very minimal for whatever reason. And so Despina proposed essentially what later became the Spanish Inquisition. He was ahead of the curve, if you will. He proposed it in 1461 to Alonso de Oropesa, the head of the Order of Saint Jerome. And Oropesa defended Conversos, interestingly enough. I believe, if I remember correctly, Oropesa was actually from a Converso background. I would have to double check, but I believe that is referenced in my book. So he rejected it, but it would eventually become the basis for what we would call the National Inquisition, the Holy Office of the Inquisition that was adopted by King Ferdinand of Aragon and Queen Isabel of Spain, of Castile. And of course, that model would become the model for the Portuguese Inquisition that would take hold in the 16th century. Now, what's interesting is that Despina, of course, focuses in on individuals who are very open about their Judaizing. And this always reminds us that there was a broad spectrum of individuals. There were some individuals who were very open about the fact that they did not want to be Christian. There were some individuals who sort of maintained this sort of hybrid existence where there was a combination of beliefs and practices. And then, of course, there were other individuals that after some time had effectively, I wouldn't say given up, but they weren't necessarily concerned with the fine details of what was Christian and what was Jewish. And of course, there were some individuals who had completely adopted Christianity out of sincerity or because they believed that that was the best future for them. Now, I think it's important to note that it's often complicated to know exactly what a person is thinking. There's a case that I mentioned in Secret Jews. There's a gentleman by the name of Ramon Splugues, I think is the way that you pronounce his last name. He was from the city of Morvedre, near the town of Valencia. Valencia in 1391 had been heavily hit by the violence, and almost no Jews survived as Jews The entire community was basically converted to Christianity, and several hundred, depending on the which numbers we use, several hundred Jews were killed during the violence. The town that survived with most of its Jewish community intact was Mourvedre, which was not too far away. And Splugues was from this town. Now, what's interesting about him is that his conversion came about much later. Um, what is sort of interesting is that he was a very knowledgeable individual. He used to give drashot, sermons in the synagogue. He could obviously, he had some familiarity with Hebrew, I think quite a bit, actually, because he would teach other conversos in Hebrew. He would teach them Hebrew. He would read from Jewish text. So he had a very high knowledge of Jewish learning. But he had an issue. He had this fascination, I guess you could say, with Christian women. So he had many paramours, and out of the consequence of one of these relationships, one of these affairs, he one of his paramours, one of his lovers, was expecting, and so he wanted to raise the child Jewish, even though the wife was not, or the mistress was not halachically Jewish. And the conflict that this spurred between his family was such that he, out of anger, converted. And when he basically regretted this right after he had done this. When he was asked why he had done this, what particular passage of scripture, what argument had been given that he had given into Christian arguments, he said, they didn't convince me of anything. He goes, I could have defeated them easily because he was a very well-known, well-studied individual. And he said, I converted out of anger. Now, he didn't leave it at that. He began to almost go on a campaign of trying to bring back Conversos to Judaism. And he even went to the point of trying to convert non-Jews to Judaism. Now, sometimes this would happen in the midst of his various romantic relationships. Toward the end of his life, when he was arrested for Judaizing, one of his, I don't know if she was technically married to him or was a mistress, who was not halachically Jewish, she was arrested as well for Judaizing, and they both were executed at the stake for that. Now, he was very brazen and open about that. He would actually argue with old Christians about the veracity of Judaism. And it's just amazing that you would find an individual so flagrantly open about their beliefs to the point of combating somebody, at least verbally, about religious issues. And so the reason I mention him is that sometimes Alonso de Espina's arguments are considered to be, I wouldn't say hyperbole, but sometimes people say, oh, he's probably exaggerating, that Conversos were so open about their Judaizing, and the way he paints it is that there's tons of them circumcising themselves and their sons. Well, maybe that wasn't necessarily the case the way that Espina describes it, but on the other hand, I'm not sure that that's necessarily out of the picture as well. I think you had pockets of individuals who were very committed to Jewish life as best as they were able to. And I think inevitably, based off of this type of account, the Splugues account of things that we see, and I mentioned briefly about 1449, some of the violence that took place in Toledo and the purity of blood laws, and other violence that takes place later on in 1467, 1473. Some of the friction there is based off of certain activities. And I mentioned, of course, that in the Edict of Expulsion, you have references to Jews providing non-Jews with, conversos, not to non-Jews, but conversos with information about Judaism, kashrut, kosher food, all these types of things. And I think when you look at the picture as a whole, you find that there were these different groups that were indeed doing their best to maintain Jewish life. I have various activities like this that are referenced in Secret Jews. And you find in I think it's called The Jewish Renaissance in 15th Century Spain. I can't think of the author off the top of my head, I apologize, but you could look him up, where he specifically refers to the relationship between Conversos in Valencia and Jews in Mourvedre, and I make reference to that in Secret Jews. But you have family relationships that exist, and sometimes those families will do a lot of things to help their Converso brothers And sometimes the Converso families will do things to assist parts of the Jewish family. That doesn't mean that there aren't conflicts at times, but one of the things that that comes out is that it's just like anything else. Relationships are complicated. Sometimes, just as one group of people might not like another group of people, you might have conflicts that exist between Conversos and Jews, but it has nothing to do necessarily with their Converso or Jewish status. It's just that one person doesn't like another person, and it's a personal issue. It's not a, if you will, a class issue. Let me look up just very quickly, because I'm bothered by the fact that I can't remember. Let me see if I can look that title up. So I'm looking here. Let's see. And of course, as I'm looking through my oh yes, it's Mark Meyerson. Yes, it's a Jewish Renaissance in 15th century Spain. That's the book that I wanted to reference. It's interesting because it includes some information about relationships of conversos with Jews, but also with Muslims. So that's interesting because there's also a Muslim population in the greater area of Valencia and in the areas of Morvedres. So that's interesting. I think the other thing that we want to discuss also is that one thing that's important to note is that we don't know to what extent the Jewish knowledge of individuals was before the mass conversions. What I mean to say is that sometimes we have this image of individuals knowing that they're, if you will, super Jews, I guess you could say, that they're tremendously knowledgeable about Judaism, and then this conversion happens and they sort of transmit that with them. But I think it's important to note, if God forbid we would have a situation in America where there were mass conversions, how many Jews actually would be knowledgeable about Judaism in such a way to be able to transmit their faith in a way that would be consistent with traditional Jewish practice? And I mention this because as we look at some of the cases that are reported, as the Inquisition eventually takes off toward the latter part of the 15th century. And the reason I mention this in part is because I'm working on another book on the Jewish Conquistadors. And many of the practices that come about that are reported in the Inquisition's accounts sometimes are rather bizarre. They don't match up exactly with what we would expect to be quote-unquote Jewish practices, but they're identified as Jewish practices by the inquisitors or the witnesses that are present at the trials. And part of this shows that, one, is that there's a lack of continuity between Jewish instruction between generations. And I think that's important to note, because if you're talking about 1391 is the initial phase of violence. There's violence again in 1406. There's mass conversions in 1412 to 1415. By the time we get to the 1450s, we're already you could say 2 generations, maybe a generation 2, something like that, depending on how we count them, that have elapsed. There's still Jews present in the peninsula. There's still plenty of Jewish contact, but inevitably over time that contact begins to diminish, obviously eventually with the expulsion in 1492, but the knowledge base for Conversos begins to change. And so many of the practices that they undertake now have sort of an added complexity, because now their contact with practicing Jews has diminished. And they're almost, in a sense, having, I wouldn't say inventing, but they're having to reconstruct and adapt ideas that are coming in from the outside. And the reason I mention this in part is because when I mentioned that Alonso de Espina was quoting or referring to conversos that were critiquing the New Testament, that it was misquoting or misapplying quotes from the Tanakh. It's interesting that you have individuals now who are familiar with the New Testament to a certain extent. Now, we don't know if this is a byproduct of them attending services, if they're doing active study on their own accord, or these are friars that are teaching people or not, because the reality is that the majority of conversos are not receiving a thoroughly extensive Catholic education. They're not being educated in the catechism. They're not being educated within the rites of the church. So it's interesting, because the fact that you have some individuals that do seem to have some exposure they're inevitably going to be transmitting some of these elements to their family members and to their relatives and to their friends and so forth that are in this community of Conversos that in many ways continues to expand, because remember, it's a self-perpetuating group. So all these things are important because I think that even though the practices themselves may not have been quote unquote strictly Jewish as we would understand them, the motivations for many practices that will later be identified by Conversos may have been adopted as substitutes or as things that they understood to be related to Judaism, almost as a response to the greater Christian environment that they're living in. So in any case, we'll go ahead and stop there. That's a lot of information. In future videos, we'll continue our discussion about some of the things that are happening in the 1440s, 1450s, 1460s, as we lead up to the point of the Inquisition, and look at some of the ideas that are arising there at that time, why the Inquisition is brought into being in this new form, and what the goals are from the perspective of the monarchs, and what the effects are on the Jewish community.